wait to be what you've been called to be. You can't wait on their affirmation. You can't wait on their approval. You can't wait on their support. Sometimes you just got to run and look behind you and say, everybody who wants to run, run, but I can't stop running because you're not running. Listen to me, hear me. You can't stop chasing your dream just because somebody in your life won't chase it. You can't stop believing in yourself just because somebody in your life won't believe in you. You can't stop chasing the dreams of your life just because when you know when you do it, you're going to have to do it all by yourself.
Good afternoon. Peru, Colombia, and Bolivia identify and understand the hidden risks in mining supply chain. My name is Fabiana Di Lorenzo from Level Sources, and I will be moderating this webinar. I'm here in the company of 4 guests, and I would like to introduce them to you. I'm here with Alice Van Ark, Director of CNV International, Frank Wagemans, Senior Engagement Specialist at Acme Investment Management, Tony Spopema, Global Head of Compliance at Nierstar, and Olga Van Lauwen, Project Leads at the Secretariat of the International Responsible Business Conduct Agreement for Metal Sector at the CER. Before we start, I want to inform you that this webinar is run in 2 channels, English and Spanish, and you can choose the language if you go at the bottom right hand of your screen. During the webinar, I invite you all to leave questions in the dedicated questions section, and I will try to make sure they are answered throughout this session. Now, without further ado, I would like to kick off this section by showing you a video produced by CNV entitled Outsourcing Miners, the Hidden Phase of Peruvian Mining. The video has English voiceover, but with English-Spanish subtitles. Shall we launch the video, please?
Outsourced miners, the hidden face of Peruvian mining. The beautiful city of Amsterdam has many shops that sell products that contain metals from Peru. Lead, selenium, aluminum, copper, zinc, nickel, among others. Nowadays, it is difficult to find an activity, structure, or object without metals. Did you know, for instance, that 25% of your mobile phone is made of aluminum, copper, steel, silver and zinc?
Oh ja, deze is leuk. Ziet er goed uit.
Ja, zeker.
This is Sander, a European consumer who perhaps ignores that he is part of a value chain, that he is the last link in a cycle that begins on the other side of the Atlantic. Peru is ranked among the top producers and exporters of metals, both in Latin America and worldwide. Thousands of people work in the mining units nestled in the high Andes Mountains. It is estimated that 70% of them are subcontracted by a third party rather than directly by the mine. Victor is one of them. He lives high in the Andes, far from the great centers of power, where the government has little presence and where the economy and the daily life of the communities revolve around mining. The pandemic has made this even more evident.
Que las empresas mineras poco valoran a sus trabajadores, a pesar que nosotros producimos el oro, el cobre, el zinc, etcétera, etcétera, muchos minerales que lo venden a nivel mundial. Y todas las empresas mineras, a pesar de ello, no han cumplido los protocolos correspondientes sobre el COVID-19. Producto de ese incumplimiento, muchos compañeros mineros han sido afectados, enfermos en todas las empresas mineras de todo el Perú. Producto de ello, inclusive han sido contagiados en su trabajo y también a sus familias en su casa.
As a result, thousands of miners have been infected. To make matters worse, many of them have been fired or sent home. Their contracts were suspended and they have not been paid for months.
La pandemia en realidad ha sido muy provechoso para las empresas mineras, gran minería, mediana minería y pequeña minería, porque las empresas han aplicado suspensión perfecta de labores sin remuneración alguna a todos los trabajadores terciarizados, y eso ha afectado mucho económicamente a todos los trabajadores que vivimos de la minería. Es más, a los trabajadores, en este caso mío, personalmente, me han retirado del trabajo, aprovechando esta pandemia, retirando a la empresa contratista que yo laboraba, dejándome sin trabajo hasta estos momentos.
Victor is one of the many miners who perform strategic tasks in the mines, many of them risky. The miners often have no certainty about who employs them or pays their wages. In 2015, the Peruvian government passed the Outsourcing law, which allows subcontracting of personnel with temporary contracts. Since then, the number of people working under this modality has grown by more than 50%. Data from 2019 shows that out of the 208,716 mining workers hired in Peru, over 141,000 were hired through a third party. An outsourced worker? But what is wrong about that? Work is work. Of course, but the working conditions for the employees often fall short of the standards laid out in the conventions established by the International Labour Organization, ILO.
La tercerización, incluso sin ser fraudulenta, afecta a los derechos de los trabajadores. En primer lugar, genera incertidumbre sobre quién es el empleador y, por tanto, a quién exigir el cumplimiento de los derechos. En segundo lugar, implica contratos de muy corta duración para los trabajadores, que afectan sus proyectos de vida. Además de ello, impide o dificulta la sindicalización. Las actividades en las que se recurre masivamente a la tercerización tienen bajas tasas de afiliación sindical. Finalmente, como la tercerización suele ser una estrategia de rebaja de costos, genera diferencia en las condiciones de trabajo, pues ese menor costo se traduce en remuneraciones menores y en menores condiciones de seguridad y salud que los trabajadores directamente contratados. Y esto ocurre a pesar de que trabajadores tercerizados y directamente contratados desarrollan trabajos iguales o equiparables o están expuestos a los mismos riesgos.
But how is it possible? Aren't Victor and his colleagues the one who, through their work, are generating enormous wealth for Peru? Certainly, and they allow people in developed countries like Sander to meet their demands for comfort and also satisfy the need for raw materials for the world's great economies to function. More and more European investors and companies that import metals from countries like Peru are demanding that large-scale mining operations adhere to socially responsible business standards. Something is happening with mining workers in Peru. To be continued.
To join me. And Alice, first of all, thank you for producing this very interesting video. And I know CMB has written a position paper on the risks related to outsourcing mining services, which is available online on CMB website, and I invite everyone to read it. It's a very interesting reading. And Alice, would you like to share with us the most important learning from that study?
Yes, thank you, Fabiana. Thank you all for being here. I'm Alice van Ark. I'm the director of CNV International, and I will present the findings of a research that we have conducted in Peru and a position paper we wrote about outsourcing in Peru, Colombia, and Bolivia. We have conducted a field study in Junín and Cusco region in 2020. Between March and September 2020, a researcher called Garis Mujica conducted this field study for us. We have conducted 182 surveys of workers and also 44 semi-structured interviews with people working in the value chain, such as outsourced workers, local authorities, and other specialists. First of all, outsourcing. What are we talking about? Of course, the video that you just have seen already explains a little bit the topic of today's webinar. But briefly, outsourced workers in the mining industry are workers who are working for an outside contractor, a third party. they are not directly linked to the mining company. Outsourcing in mining can be seen as a way to have one work done in a mine which is specialized. But outsourcing is very common practice. However, there are some serious downsides that we want to talk about. First of all, if outsourced workers are basically doing the same work but under different labor conditions, it implies discrimination. Because the effect on outsourced workers is that they earn less and work in less safe environments while they are doing basically the same work, side by side by the direct workers. It's also almost impossible to unionize for outsourced workers. The reason is that outsourced workers only receive temporary contracts. This puts them in a very vulnerable position. We have seen that outsourcing is used as a cost reduction strategy of large mining companies, rather than a way to specialize or a way to for other reasons. In our field study in Peru, we have seen that the labor rights of outsourced workers in the 2 mining regions are being violated. Workers hired by a contracted company receive less training on health and safety practice. In addition, outsourced workers have hardly any chance to get organized in a union. What we have also seen is that a mining operations core business is outsourced. So it's not specialized work, but it's really the core business, such as exploitation and maintenance. And I will further explain this in the next slides. We've also seen that direct and outsourced workers perform the same high-risk tasks, but under very different conditions. And it's not something that is seen on a very rare basis. You can see this diagram, which shows that 70% of all workers in Peru are hired by outsourced companies. What we have also seen is that there are short-term contracts is frequently used. Most workers get only 2 to 3 months contracts, which increases the chance that they lose their employment and also affects their freedom of association. If, for example, if you have only a 2-month contract, well, you only have hardly time to get unionized. Or if you try to set up a union, you probably will lose your job. What we have also seen is that outsourced workers often don't get their overtime paid. This diagram is quite small, but if you want to study it in more depth, you can also read or position paper in which you can find the diagrams, the figures that I will be showing. In both regions, our studies showed that significant parts of the mining operations core business are being outsourced. This includes the core exploitation phases and the maintenance processes, where some tasks are high risk and require physical labor. Outsourcing is taking place within the core business of the mining companies. This consists of extraction, crushing, and concentration of minerals. In both mining sites that we studied, outsourced workers perform extraction tasks that involves drilling, blasting, loading, and hauling. These are high-risk tasks, and within the mining production chain, they are also the most labor-intensive. The figures that I'm showing here, figure 1 and 2, in the next slides, show where temporary workers are being used at the 2 mining sites studied. And we try to show with these figures that the outsourced workers are basically doing the same type of task, really the core business. Here you see also the purple one shows that outsourcing company and the mining company are basically in the same doing the same type of task. Means that a outsourced worker is working side by side with a direct worker. Do we recognize this situation in general in Peru and other countries? Well, first we look at Peru. By analyzing data and researching different sources, we see that these issues are generally occurring in Peru. Peru is also in the top 5 of global producer of minerals such as copper and zinc. In Peru, we also see that 70% of the total employment in the mining sector consists of outsourced workers. This is also shown in the diagram you see in the screen. The way how the mining industry is heavily leaning on the work of outsourced workers causes many negative effects. First of all, we see that more fatal accidents are happening compared to direct workers. It's also acknowledged by various sources that wage gaps exist between direct workers and the outsourced workers. In addition, we see that collective rights are affected because outsourced workers cannot form a union. Even if they try to form a union, they're still not linked to the main employer. So they cannot really claim their rights in that sense. Governments are also not able to enforce legislation, which is of course a problem. For example, in the Peruvian law, it's clear when outsourced work is allowed and when it's not allowed. And it's also clear that many subcontracting companies do not comply with the requirements to legally execute this activity. But however, we see that the labor inspection is not able to enforce the law. We also see, and which is a problem, of course, for trade unions like us who want to monitor, and also for labor inspections who wants to monitor, that multinational mining companies hardly specify data on the workforce. And also very limited labor inspections take place. Now we look at the situation in Colombia. Is it much different? Well, here also we found that the majority of workers, outsourced workers, have short-term contracts between 3 to 6 months. Here it's also clear that there's a wage gap. We see 30% difference in salary and also difference in labor stability, of course. If you only have a 3 to 6 month contract, we see the labor stability is different between direct workers and outsourced workers. We also see that the unions of indirect workers are not well represented. For example, the large unions that we have in Colombia do not represent direct workers. In addition, what worsens the situation here is that Colombia is in the top 10 worst countries for working people. Between January 2019 and March 2020, so a little bit more than 1 year, 14 union leaders were killed in Colombia. And the mining sector and energy sector is one of the sectors that is most affected by this extreme level of violence. In our position paper, we also look at the situation in Bolivia. We see a different situation here. First of all, we see a very important role for the Bolivian state in the mining production. What we also see that outsourcing, very different from Peru and Colombia, outsourcing in Bolivia is strictly regulated. It's not possible to outsource core activities like in Peru and Colombia. We also see that a part of the mining work is done by mining cooperatives that organize independent miners. Cooperatives are the largest employer in the mining sector. Some of these smaller cooperatives have only 12 members, like a dozen of members. Some of the larger cooperatives have 1,000 members or more. So there's a very huge difference between the member counts. What we see in these cooperatives, we see low wages. First of all, the mining workers don't get a salary. They get only paid for the minerals they extract. We see also a minimal investment by these cooperatives for safety measures and technology. This basically means that workers continue to work with pick and hammer. Are the multinational companies linked? Yes, they are. We see that multinational mining companies in cooperative supply chains are linked because they directly or indirectly purchase from these cooperatives, which you can also see in the diagram that we have made. Some key takeaways. Legal frameworks differ per country. Outsourcing is allowed but risky, and temporary workers used in an improper way. Well, for example, what we mean by that, outsourcing is used in a situation where there's an employer-employee relationship. In Bolivia, we see that mining cooperatives provide cheap labor. Products are sold to local buyers who bring them to the international markets through smelters and traders. We also see that outsourcing is not implemented as specialized labor, but it's part of the core business. And we see that mainly in Peru and Colombia. We also see that outsourcing leads to fundamental rights violation, in particular freedom of association, which of course, as a trade union, for us, that's a very important point. In Bolivia, we see abuse within cooperatives, and we see very poor working conditions. So that's also a risk for the multinational mining companies that are linked to Bolivia. We see that also, in generally speaking, that little information on outsourcing is kept by the ministries of labor and by the companies themselves. We also see that outsourcing is used as a method for reducing expenses rather than increasing efficiency. And last but not least, we see a lack of subcontractor worker representation. Like the unions represent only the direct workers, but are not able to represent the indirect workers. And of course, we have some recommendations. You can look back these recommendations in our position paper, but I want to highlight them here in this presentation. First of all, we think it's important to increase transparency within the supply chain. It must be increased so that stakeholders in the supply chain can hold each other accountable for proper use of outsourcing in a mining value chain. Secondly, we also think that it's important to set up data portals to make information regarding outsourcing available, and we also think that the risk related to risks should be publicly available. We also, thirdly, insist on better monitoring systems regarding improper use of outsourcing in order to facilitate the work of the labor inspection. Fourth point, mining companies should take responsibility. They should develop a providers protocol aimed at recognizing and preventing improper outsourcing practices. We have 4 more recommendations, in total 8. The 5th recommendation is that we think it's important to have solidarity between the contracting company and the mining company. They should have the same responsibility for their workers. We also think, this point 6, that mining companies must ensure freedom of association and ensure that it also is respected by their providers, by the contracting companies. 7, within the guidelines of the OECD, we think that it's important to draw up specific OECD guidelines to recognize improper use of outsourcing and guarantee freedom of association. And our last point, last recommendation, is that mining standards and industry associations should include requirements on outsourcing for the mining companies in their standards. And with these recommendations, I would like to end this presentation, and I would really welcome you to read our position paper that you can find on the website of CMV International. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice, for this presentation. I think I would like to just take the opportunity to ask you one of the many questions that arrived, so that we will try to answer the rest at the end. But one that is quite important and relevant, I think, is how the UNGPs and standards like these can help with managing the risks of outsourcing services, and what is the leverage that companies that buy from these mining companies have to rectify this issue?
Yes, thank you, Fabiana, for this really good question. Well, I think the UNGP is a very important instrument here. However, it's not very much used. We see that multinational companies, if they take the responsibility, they also have the responsibility for the outsourced workers. And this is I think here the problem, they currently only look at the 30% workers that are not directly, that are directly hired by them. And the UNGPs, if you really follow their due diligence, they should also look at the outsourced workers, because the workers are working in their chain as part of their company, and this is currently the problem that we see. So if you follow the UNGPs, the mining companies have the responsibility to look further at the chain, to look also at the outsourced companies that are working basically for them, and not putting the responsibility towards the contracting companies, because that's what currently is happening.
Thank you, Alice, for this. And I feel like it's a very good question, given the fact that the EU is passing mandatory due diligence legislation aligned with UNGP. And as we speak about leverages, let's move on to discuss with Frank and Tonis, if you can join the digital platform or digital stage. Frank, you are an investor, and I would like to really hear your thoughts in relation to the findings of the research. And what do you think the role of investor should be in managing this type of risks?
Well, the short answer is yes, but I will also try to give a little bit of a longer answer. Just to give you some background, I work for Achmea Investment Management. We manage the funds of Achmea, which is an insurance company. But we also work for several Dutch pension funds. And my work specifically is to enter into the dialogues in the companies in which we are shareholder. And we do that on several environmental, social, or governance themes. And the mining sector has been an important, focal point also for us. As shown in the video, the mining sector plays a very important role in providing resources for, everyday products, also for the energy transition. But we also see that there are quite some concerns in regards to sustainability, being it climate change, being it labor rights, being it human rights. And in that sense, also for us, it's a difficult sector to work with. We see, as also shown in the video, as very complicated supply chains, active in very different jurisdictions. A lot of joint ventures. So also for us as investors, there isn't that much transparency. It has been increasing over the years, but still also for us it's a difficult sector to work with. That's why also in the Netherlands there is a Dutch governance process, in which, for example, pension funds, the Social Economic Council, labor unions, and NGOs work together on these topics. And in that sense, I think the research of CNV International has been really helpful, because it provides us with a sort of on-the-ground view of the problems taking place. And I think the points raised in the report are very well founded. We also see that especially subcontracting is, I won't say totally off the radar of the mining companies, but we see that it's often overlooked, and a lot of mining companies should certainly improve on that area. And how could they do so? Maybe, and that's maybe the shareholder perspective. We don't see that it is often a point discussed on board level, and I think we should. Personally, I think the tone should be from the top, that this is a serious issue and it should be addressed. We see that some companies have policies on that, but also, like Alice mentioned, not only mentioning the OECD guidelines, but also stipulating what that should mean for a mining company in regards to subcontracting is very important and often not yet done. Screening of subcontractors, increasing that transparency is an important step companies should take. And that's maybe a very important point, starting to work together. So the mining sector should take up this challenge to work together, but also establish the dialogue with labor unions, and not only for the direct employees, but also especially maybe the labor unions for subcontractors, because it is overlooked, and based on the OECD guidelines, as a mining company, you have a responsibility on this issue. And last but not least, but maybe that's also from our own interest, increased transparency. Because if we look at the annual reports, at the CSR reports, for us as investors, it's very hard to grasp how well or how bad a mining company is managing this risk. So, well, I have been talking on the companies, but of course, this is also a call for us as investors. And I think we should play an important role to put this topic on the agenda of mining companies, identify especially the companies which are lagging behind on this topic, also identifying the best practices for mining companies that have taken steps on this topic, and also use our influence, but maybe also jointly with other stakeholders to nudge, maybe push companies to take that extra step and to take the OECD guidelines seriously and to take them into practice.
Thank you, Frank. And from the investment world, let's move to the mining world. Tonis, you're the head of compliance for trading and mining. I would like to ask you, what can mining companies do in practical terms to manage the risks of labor rights being undermined throughout the procuring of services, or human rights in general?
Yes, thanks, Fabiana. Well, indeed, I work for Nearstar, and we are globally active in the zinc and lead mining and smelting industry. We have several mines in Australia, Canada, and the US, but not in Latin America. But we do get supplied externally from higher risk countries, and we certainly want to address negative issues in the chain. But Fabiana, the problem is not restricted to outsourcing. Outsourcing is a symptom of what we've seen over the years in many areas of corporates, depending on raw materials, is taking not enough responsibility throughout their supply chain. And I think mining and metals companies need to get a grip over their complete supply chain. And Alice already said it, create visibility and transparency in the supply chain and take responsibility when something's wrong. Companies cannot just say that they have no oversight over what happens, on site in remote places in the periphery. Frank also just mentioned outsourcing and subcontracted is sometimes overlooked because it happens in the periphery and not in the middle of the organization itself. So what can you do? Well, it's an open door, but it's do more and more due diligence, take action based on that due diligence. Not just do research behind the desk. Outsourcing should be a red flag in certain countries. Get a grip over your supply chain and do research and know what happens in certain countries. You can draw a comparison with the battle against corruption in the supply chain. In the old days, companies relied on their business partners to basically do their dirty work. But due to public opinion, NGO involvement and certainly stricter laws like the UK Bribery Act, the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, companies cannot get away with corruption in their supply chain anymore. And, we now see a tendency also in the human rights area that there's more regulation coming up that helps. In the EU, we now get new human rights legislation. In Australia, we have a very strict Modern Slavery Act. So 5 to 10 years ago, there was not a lot of due diligence carried out in the area of human rights. In corruption, yes, but not in the human rights area and for outsourcing. And, even though it's maybe not enough at this time, it does start to take off. My organization as well, we're certainly not there yet, but we do a lot of, good due diligence. My currently is implementing far-reaching requirements mandated by the LME, the London Metals Exchange, regarding responsible sourcing, ethical supply chains and mineral sourcing. These are mandated, and sometimes you need to stick to implement it. It's not voluntary anymore. You prefer it to be voluntary, but it's not anymore. And for companies that do not want to implement it, the net is closing. There's no choice anymore. And later on in this webinar, we'll hear from Olga about the IRBC, which is the International Responsible Business Covenant, we as Nearstar, we also signed up to that, because even though it's a voluntary initiative, we believe it's very important. But I already mentioned the LME requirements, which are extremely far-reaching. So to summarize that first step, I think due diligence is crucial. But do not create a paper tiger. Do not just do research from behind the desk. And of course, now with COVID, it's difficult to go on site. But as a mining and metals company, go on site, speak to the people. Create transparency and talk about your values and make sure that if you see things, address those issues. Create a management framework within your company with a grievance mechanism for, not just your employees, as Alice already said, but also for others in the supply chain. Make sure that everyone in the organization is aware of what's going on, on site in the mine and take action. And I think it's basically the problem is that it's often just literally far away. It's as I mentioned, it's in the periphery. It's not always that they do not want it, but it's that what you don't see is it's just not there. And I think right now, as I said, the net is closing. There's so much more regulation, but also so many NGOs and so many customers and consumers that are asking much more of us. Whether it be bribery, whether it be misconduct in the mines, or just the problems of outsourcing that we've just seen. We cannot ignore these issues anymore. So summarizing, what can we do? I mentioned the due diligence, but really make due diligence work, not from behind the desk, but go on site and make sure that you address the issues and follow up. And fortunately, I would say, as a compliance professional, there's legislation, there's regulation in this area in order for the organizations to not be able to ignore it anymore. So I think that the next couple of years will be extremely interesting to see what happens in human rights areas from the perspective of the big companies. We're going to see a lot in the next couple of years.
Thank you, Thomas, and this was a very exhaustive answer. Thank you, both of you. I will come back to you, I think, after we show the next video, because I feel there are some additional questions we might want to discuss. So may I ask then to launch the next video entitled Violated Rights and an Illusionary Freedom of Association. And we'll reconvene after this video.
Outsourced miners, violated rights and outsourced miners, the hidden face of Peruvian mining. The beautiful city of Amsterdam has many shops that sell galleries. About 600 meters below ground, we find José Alcedo along with dozens of workers who carry out many of the tasks which make this profitable business possible.
Nosotros como tercerizados en la unidad de Chuchaco somos los que estamos encargados de la explotación, ¿no? El traslado de mineral, el tema para nosotros poder sacar los minerales mediante las perforaciones y voladuras en cuanto al sostenimiento. En pocas palabras, toda la producción, lo que le hacen la unidad de Chuchacua, es netamente por los trabajadores terciarizados.
Outsourcing in Peru is legal, and it is justified as a way of reducing costs in order to make the sector more competitive worldwide. So leaving the hiring of mine workers in the hands of third parties is a way to achieve that. It is not a secret that it is cheaper and easier to rotate workers who just do not have any contract stability. This translates into great savings in profit sharing and overtime payment, and the access to health security becomes cheaper as well.
Se produce una pauperización de los trabajadores subcontratados respecto de las condiciones que tenían, tanto económicas como de seguridad y de salud, cuando pertenecían a la planilla de la empresa. El efecto principal es ese, El efecto principal es abaratar los costos en función de reducir el pago remunerativo y reducir las condiciones de seguridad y salud.
One of the arguments that justifies labor outsourcing is the need to get highly specialized and qualified workers who can be essential for the production chain. But is this the case of metal mining in Peru?
Y yo no niego que en ciertos casos esto se hace. Pero si vemos las estadísticas, vamos a encontrarnos con que 4/5 partes de los trabajadores tercerizados están picando piedra. Es decir, 4 de cada 5 están haciendo la labor más elemental de las que se hacen en la minería.
These workers are responsible for the key tasks of the productive chain. However, they don't have any job stability because they are always working with fixed-term contracts, which generally do not go further than 3 months. And this situation just keeps happening year after year. This recurrent use of short-term contracts makes workers really vulnerable, and it is the perfect scenario for the violation of labor rights. This also has an impact in the freedom of the workers to request the compliance of labor regulations, to ask for better working conditions, and exercise their right of freedom of association.
El tema del abuso sindical se está viendo de que los trabajadores no se manifieste mucho o hagan un reclamo. ¿Por qué? Porque verdaderamente los trabajadores tienen ese temor, y ya pasó también, en que no le están renovando los contratos a los trabajadores.
Outsourced workers can in fact join a union, but when their contracts are terminated or are not renewed, the relation with the union is just uncertain.
Hemos perdido algo de 250 afiliados, en donde han sido retirados por el caso de términos de contrato, de trabajadores que ya trabajaban 8, 9 años, inclusive había hasta de 15, 18 años en la unidad, trabajando de empresa en empresa.
Under these conditions, the renewal of contracts becomes a way to intimidate workers. It puts pressure on them to decide whether to become part of the union or not. It is even worse, as in some cases the organizations are decapitated by not renewing the contracts of union leaders, which leaves them leaderless. Also, the power of negotiation of unions whose members are mostly outsourced workers is lost in the tangle of contracting companies which may exist at a big mining unit.
¿Y qué es lo que sucede? Que donde tenías un sindicato fuerte, tienes ahora 8 sindicatos, el de la principal y 7 de empresas de tercerización. 7 sindicatos, de los cuales el único que tiene un poder de negociación, digamos, mayor poder de negociación es el de la principal. Las de las contratistas viven una especie de negociación fantasma.
And what's the position of companies who own the mine?
A veces nosotros como sindicato reclamamos a la empresa principal, pero lamentablemente simplemente ellos nos responden de que ustedes son de empresa terciarizadora y tienen que conversar con las empresas terciarizadoras, más no con ellos, a pesar que ellos son los dueños de casa, no es una empresa titular. Ellos tienen que ver qué problemas tienen las empresas contratistas para dar solución.
Something is happening with mining workers in Peru. It is about time for the other big players in this international productive chain to ensure a responsible business conduct.
For this video. Let's now move to Olga. Olga, I'm turning to you. We have seen this video, and that outsourcing can come with considerable risks. You're the project lead at the International Responsible Business Conduct Agreement for the metal sector at the SIR, and would you like to tell us how the covenant works and what it does in practice? And I would also like to ask what kind of different stakeholders, what can they do to assess and mitigate these risks which occurs in the mining and through procuring of services?
Yes. Thank you so much, Fabiana, for this question, and also thanks to CNV for having me today. Yeah, as said, I'm working at the Social and Economic Council. I work at the Secretariat of the Metals Agreement. The Social and Economic Council is an advisory body on social and economic topics for the Dutch government and parliament. And in this council, employers, employees, and independent experts work together to reach agreement on social and economic topics. But it also facilitates agreements, such as the Dutch Energy Agreement for Sustainable Growth, and since a few years also the agreements on international responsible business conduct, about which I will talk today. So let me first address the question what international RBC agreements are, and importantly, why they are in place. I'm sure we all remember this terrible image. It is the Rana Plaza garment factory collapse in 2013, and unfortunately there were more than 1,000 fatalities. And in this factory, garment tags were also found of brands selling in the Netherlands. And in turn, the Dutch government decided that companies in the Netherlands should not be linked or be responsible for such fatalities. And at the same time, as Thomas also mentioned, there were growing expectations from civil society organizations, consumers, and shareholders with respect to responsible business conduct. And what you saw as a consequence as well is that the guidelines of the United Nations and the OECD were growing in importance as well, and in relevance. So as a consequence, the Social and Economic Council was asked for an advisory report on how to address this in the Netherlands, and establishing agreements for international responsible business conduct was the answer. And the advisory report of the Social and Economic Council called for sectors to take the initiative to enter into multi-stakeholder agreements. And the goals being of these multi-stakeholder agreements to collectively address risks and violations, as companies cannot tackle these issues on their own, and also to achieve concrete positive impact in supply chains within 3 to 5 years. So the advisory report of the Social and Economic Council led to negotiations for different international RBC agreements for sectors considered as high risks, which you can see here on this slide. Separate agreements for the financial sector were established, as the financial sector is, through its investments, lendings, and trading, involved in many different sectors. But of course, where relevant, we link activities of the financial sector agreements to the activities of the other sector agreements. So the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the relevant OECD sector guidances, but also the United Nations guiding principles for business and human rights and the relevant ILO-conventions are the basic principles of each of the agreements. And all the agreements are have a multi-stakeholder approach. And they consist of these 5 constituencies. For example, the pension fund agreement, of which ACMEA is part, has in total 80 pension funds joining 6 non-governmental organizations, 3 trade unions, 3 ministries, and 1 industry association. And CNV is also a part of the pension funds agreement. So The agreements all have a three-way approach. So companies are required to carry out due diligence in accordance with the relevant OECD due diligence guidance. They don't have to do this by themselves. Tools are being offered to them to assist them with this. All parties together should establish collective initiatives to make use of the collective leverage these organizations have together. And very important as well is to start a collective project on the ground to achieve a concrete positive impact within 3 to 5 years. So now I would like to move on to the question on how the metals agreement can be a solution to risk related to outsourcing. So one of the activities within the metals agreement for the companies is to develop a heat map. So this heat map contains information about materials, supplier countries, and related identified risks and impacts. Companies don't have to develop such a heat map by their own. They get offered a tool to do this, and of course they have access to the other organizations within the agreement, and they should also consult them in order to get a good understanding of the risks in their supply chain. Consequently, a collective heat map will be developed, and that will present the industry's risks and impacts. And this information will be used to develop a collective due diligence action plan. And this plan identifies the steps the parties will be taking collectively to address and mitigate the risks found by the companies. And this should eventually result in a collective project in order to reach that positive impact within the 3 to 5 years about which I talked before. And very important in this process is the consultation of stakeholders. And this is essential in order to prevent missing out on hidden risks which are, for example, related to outsourcing. The pension funds agreement has a different approach with regards to providing a solution to risks like outsourcing. With a selected group of organizations, they work on different cases. These cases are selected as a group, and the goal is, next to learning and innovating, to make use of the collective leverage the pensions funds sector has. And they use this leverage to urge on other companies to comply with human rights and environmental standards, but also, again, to achieve concrete substantial improvements within different supply chains. Two cases are being worked on at the moment, which are shown on this slide. And today's session is also one of the results of the first case presented on this slide. Now I would like to answer the final question, what different stakeholders can do to assess and mitigate risks which occur at the mining stage, but through the procuring of services. And my main answer would be join forces and work together. So as we do within the agreements for international responsible business conduct, within these agreements, we see the following responsibilities for the different organizations. So companies, the industry should carry out due diligence to assess to what extent risks related to outsourcing might be the case in their supply chain. The NGOs and also, of course, the trade unions like CNV can support the companies with providing information, but also on-the-ground assessments or research. And last but not least, the government could also support in this regard, for example, with their network of embassies or through providing financial instruments in order to support carrying out due diligence by companies or projects that should be started on the ground. Last but not least, I would like to make use of this opportunity to call on today's participants to join the Metals Agreement. We need to increase the collective leverage to address risks related to outsourcing effectively. By joining the Metals Agreement, companies learn and get offered tools to comply with the OECD due diligence guidance, which, for example, also has the benefit of lowering costs for doing due diligence. And also, it is a great opportunity to address and mitigate risks and violations to people and the environment collectively. All kind of companies active in the extractive sector can join. You don't have to be a Dutch company. It doesn't matter where you are based, and companies that are active in the entire supply chain can join the Metals Agreement. So I hope we get in touch, and I'm looking forward to hear from you either by a personal message or through the Q&A at the end of this session.
Thank you, Olga. This was very helpful and a nice linkage to the importance of using leverage when doing due diligence. And I think it's the time to take a few questions from the audience before we wrap up. I selected two, and the first one probably is for Tonnis. If all the rights are respected in Peru, then the price of raw material will be the same, or will the companies for preserving their profits increase the prices? Is there a moral hazard for the European companies that are using raw material for the individual consumers?
Thanks, Fabiana. Well, I can only speak for myself and for my own company, but I don't believe it's a matter of price. Maybe it used to be years ago, but right now, the risk of public embarrassment for large commodity traders and mining companies is much more important than just getting a cheap price. I'm absolutely convinced. My own company, Nearstar, is actually owned by a commodities trader, Trafigura, and some of you might know they certainly know how the world of trading works, and they know what to get for a certain price. But ultimately, the reputation aspect plays a much larger role than getting minerals for a cheaper price. So I'm convinced that many companies, and including my own, as I said, are willing to solve these issues by respecting the laws and act responsibly. Of course, there might be a couple of bad apples in the industry, but the majority sees this shift in public opinion, and also see the fact that more regulation comes up that gives them no alternative than solving issues like this, misconduct in their supply chain, including the outsourcing issue. So, as I already said, it's a matter of time before everyone realizes it, and there's no other way around it than solving it.
Thank you, Tonnis. That's very interesting reflection. And I think the next question is good for Fran. To what extent it is realistic to ask refiners and smelter the choke points of the supply chain to disengage when evidence of human rights abuses are found in the outsourcing services?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because as investors, we often get the question, do you keep investing in a company while there are human rights issues? And I think the OECD guidelines give you a very clear sense of what you should do, is that you should use your leverage. And the main question is a smelter or any other company, although they may be linked to the problem, are they willing to solve it? And I think that's for smelters, but as well as investors looking to companies, a very important question. Is the company in scope actively working, maybe together with other partners, to solve the problem? If that's the case, I don't think you should disengage. You should work together to solve it. If you are for sure that even after nudging, after pushing a smelter or any other company is not willing to solve the problem, then of course, then disengagement, being it from a smelter, but maybe also as an investor, as a shareholder in a company, you will come to the point in which you think, hey, maybe we should exclude this company and cease our relationship. But I think that's the end point, and certainly not the starting point.
Thank you very much, Frank. That's very clear. And Olga, I think the next question, maybe it's a clarification that you might be offering one of the attendees who says, I don't see trade unions recognition and bargaining in the IRBC presentation, but the CNV made that as a recommendation. Does this represent an implementation gap? Perhaps you can flesh out a little bit more the role of trade unions, and it might help answer this question.
Yes, thank you for this question. And the trade unions, so 2 trade unions have joined the metals agreement, and 3 trade unions have joined the pension fund agreement. And yes, risks related to the lack of collective agreements in place, or the lack of collective bargaining in place, are very well addressed within these agreements. And it is also, of course, part of the consultation, of the stakeholder consultations the companies have to do. They also have to consult the trade unions when they are looking at their supply chains. So I don't think there is an implementation gap, as the trade unions are very well represented within the IRBC agreements.
All right, perfect. Thank you. I think you might have answered that question.
Yeah, and if not,
if not, please, who wrote that question, please write a follow-up question. I'm happy to pick it up. And there was a question regarding looking for good practices in outsourcing of services. I think it's a good action for CNV, perhaps. And a question I will ask, but I'm not sure if we have an answer. If probably during your research at CNV, did you notice if any country where outsourcing was prohibited? Did you find any country where outsourcing was prohibited, and how was the transition for mining companies and workers? Did you happen to find countries where outsourcing was explicitly prohibited?
Well, I think yes. Thank you for this question. Well, we have seen, of course, Bolivia is a good example where outsourcing is not possible. But however, the picture that I've already explained is that you see mining cooperatives who have been set up, which is not the same as outsourcing, but it also involves high risks. So I would not see this as a good example. We have not come across, but we have only studied we have now focused our study on 3 countries, 3 important mining countries. But possibly if we would look at other countries, we would find better examples of good practices. And your next question was, have you, one of the people from the audience asked, have you seen good practices? Right. What we have seen as CNV, we worked together with a trade union. It was also in one of the videos. It's called Fentacam from Peru. I believe they are also attending this webinar today. We have seen this trade union as a good example because they are basically organizing only outsourced workers. And as a result of our cooperation, Fentacam has been able to organize, not only organize the workers, but also made it possible that they became hired as direct workers because they got into conversation with the mining companies, and in the end, the result was that all the people that were hired as outsourced workers, now they're direct workers. So that's a good example, but it's a very small example, right? It's only about, I think, 200 mining workers. So we wish we had more of these examples. But if anyone has a good example that we can learn from, we would really welcome you to contact us.
Perfect, thank you. And Olga, did you find, I think you found a question you wanted to give an answer to. Please go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I think there was a misunderstanding. I want to elaborate on the question that was raised before. I wanted to answer this in writing to the person. No, yeah, I just wanted to make to clarify myself, but I think I can do that in writing.
Okay, go ahead. Then I'll let you do that. Then let me take 5 minutes, perhaps, to draw the conclusions from this session. Right, we heard the importance of applying the EU NGP, meaning to assess risks for the full value chain, so you don't get blindsided by any risk you hadn't anticipated before. We talked about the importance of ensuring these kind of human rights and labor rights risks are discussed at board levels, and the role of investors in trying to push for that, and try to also advocate for greater transparency. And also the importance of investors in putting the topic on the agenda of mining companies, especially those who are not performing as well as some others that are probably already assessing human rights and labor rights risks in their supply chain. We then heard from Thonis, who put emphasis on the importance of doing more due diligence, aligning with standards and principles like the LME, the OECD, and the importance of taking actions, meaning don't do due diligence behind your desk, but actually go on the side and learn what's going on. And he also emphasized the importance of understanding human rights risks and not just limiting at assessing corruption risks. So having a full breadth of assessment, looking at the full breadth of risks when doing risks assessment. And he also emphasized the importance of having a clear grievance policy and procedure that supports employees, but also those that around the supply chain, including outsourced services employees. And the importance for companies today to have to manage reputational risks over getting materials cheap. And then we ended with Olga, who explained the importance of multi-stakeholder approach, meaning that doesn't mean dropping your individual due diligence obligation behind, which means doing your individual due diligence, but then also acting together to gain a greater leverage over your supply chain actors, especially when alone you have no enough leverage and power to drive any considerable change. Having said that, I think I'll hand over to Alice to present us the next steps and to thank everyone that attended this session. And thank you from me. It was a pleasure to chair this session.
Thank you, Fabiana. You have been an excellent host, moderator for this webinar. I think everyone probably is curious what our next steps are, because we have formulated 8 recommendations, but just formulating them and putting them here in the webinar is not going to solve these issues. So what are we going to do next? Well, first of all, we will be actively participating in the international responsible business conduct agreements, like the one on metals, for example, which was mentioned by Olga. It's the multi-stakeholder initiative in the Netherlands between the metal companies and NGOs and trade unions like us. And we will continue to map the risks and propose solutions within these agreements. More importantly as well, we will yearly publish a monitoring report on outsourcing practices in the mining industry. And we have also plans to launch a digital monitoring tool in which we really look at workers and will conduct digital surveys to get a yearly picture of the situation. We are planning, and if you're interested, are planning to have our first monitoring report by the end of this year. And we will inform all participants to this meeting about the results of this report. And please also follow us on our LinkedIn, on our social media. We are very active on these channels, and you can always see what is happening also in these issues with the mining industry. So please follow us, and we will keep you informed about all the activities that we are planning on this issue. Thank you very much, and I hope you really enjoyed this webinar, and I hope it was informative, and I really appreciate the time, and I hope you continue to work with us on these important issues. Thank you.